International Folktale and Fabling Week.
I use maps as like a wallpaper sometimes. I like maps all over my apartment.
Cool. All right. Well, just let me know when we're
already started live, so.
Oh, hello, everybody.
Sorry.
That's okay. Well, hi, everyone. I am Leanne Ball, your host today, and you have joined our Spirited History series. Today's theme is folk tales and fables from around the world. Now, if this is your first time, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm a historian and folklorist. I am also a radio host since 2008 for a show called Spirited History that highlights historic sites with a spirited past across the United States. It's every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the ParaX Radio Network. So please check us out. And I think this week we're doing Michigan, the state of Michigan, and some of the inns there, giving the history and some unusual tales that includes a floating head. I'm also a retired business owner. For 25 years, had a company called Creative Movement Connection, which offered music, movement, arts, history, science for early childhood educators and children in the daycare centers. Enjoyed doing that, but after 25 years, it was time to pass the baton. And now I'm embracing my other passion, which is history. I was a historic site coordinator for 2 large-scale historic sites here in Virginia, and now I've just concentrated on my Spirited History business, which I offer educational lectures, programs such as today, and I do historic research consults. And right now I'm working on piecing together the enslaved history at 2 large locations here in Virginia. So I'm very passionate about this part of history that needs to really come to the forefront, and I'm excited to be part of a team that's working on that. Today, I have gathered a lot of tales from all over the world, and this is International Folktales and Fables Week. Folktale is a story that's passed down verbally from generation to generation. Each storyteller adds something new to the stories, making them more interesting and fascinating as the ages pass. Different folk tales bear the characteristics of culture, folklore, and customs of the people from which they originate from. To pay homage to these folk tales and fables, March 19th through the 25th has been designated as World Folk Tales and Fables Week. And these stories with which we're familiar with and those that we haven't yet to discover originate from every part of the world. And for me, going through these different folk tales and picking ones to highlight today, it was fascinating to see how familiar some of them sound in different variations and versions, and different pieces of it go with other stories that we've heard. So sit back, enjoy, and hopefully you may discover something new, and you may want to explore further into the folktales. So let's start our journey. We have our first area that we're going to is Africa, which is the second largest continent in the world. The people from Africa include unique characteristics of their folklore, showing their way of life and animals and plants that surround them. African stories sometimes include a trickster animal or spirits as well. So our first one is about how Anansi became a spider, and this tale is from West Africa. There was once an African king who had the finest ram in the world. When this ram happened to be grazing on Anansi's crops one day, Anansi threw a rock at it, hitting it between the eyes and killing it. Anansi knew the king would punish him for what he had done to this prized ram, and he immediately schemed how he would get out of this situation. Needless to say, Anansi resorted to trickery as always. Anansi went to sit under a tree to think of an escape, when all of a sudden a nut fell and struck him on the head. Anansi immediately had an idea. First, he took the dead ram and tied it to the nut tree. Then he went to a spider and told it of a wonderful tree laden with nuts. The spider was delighted and immediately went to the tree. Anansi then went to the king and told him that a spider had evidently killed his prize ram. The ram was hanging from the tree where the spider was spinning webs. The king flew into a rage and demanded the death penalty for the spider. The king thanked Anansi and offered him a great reward. Anansi returned to the spider and warned it of the king's wrath, crying out to the world that the spider had killed the ram. And the spider was really confused by this. Anansi told the spider to go to the king and plead for mercy, and perhaps the spider's life would be spared. Meanwhile, the king had gone home for lunch and told his wife what had happened. The wife just laughed and said, "Have you lost your mind? How on earth could a little spider make a thread strong enough to hold a ram? And how in the world could that little spider hoist the ram all the way up there? Don't you know Anansi obviously killed your ram? By now you should know he is a trickster." The king was really angry that he had been deceived and told his court to fetch Anansi immediately. The king's men came for him. Anansi assumed that it was to bring him to the palace for his reward for turning in the spider. So Anansi went along willingly. He walked into the palace as if he owned it, and then he said to the king, "Well, where is my reward for the killer of your ram?" This enraged the king so much that he kicked Anansi very hard, splitting him into two pieces. He was no longer a man, but a spider with long legs. Our next story comes from Asia. Asia is the world's largest continent, a place with unique cultural heritage. Asia is the home of more than 3.8 billion people, making it the most populous continent on Earth. Even today, people around Asia hold festivals celebrating the deeds of heroes and animals from ancient folklore. Our story is The Bird with Nine Heads, and this is a Chinese folktale. Long, long ago, there once lived a king and queen who had a daughter. One day, when the daughter was walking in the garden, a tremendous storm suddenly came up and carried her away with it. Now, the storm had come from a bird with 9 heads who had robbed the princess and brought her to his cave. The king did not know whether his daughter had disappeared and whether she was alive or dead. So he proclaimed throughout the land, "Whoever brings back the princess may have her for his bride." Now, a youth had seen the bird as he was carrying the princess to the cave. This cave, though, was in the middle of a sheer rock wall. One could not climb up to it from below, nor could one climb down to it from above. And as the youth was walking around the rock, another youth came along and asked him what he was doing there. So the first youth told him that the bird with 9 heads had carried off the king's daughter and had brought her up to his cave. The other chap knew what he had to do. He called together his friends, and they lowered the youth to the cave in a basket. And when he went into the cave, he saw the king's daughter sitting there, and she was washing the wound of the bird with 9 heads. And the reason why it only has 9 heads is that 10th head was bitten off by the hound of heaven, and she was helping to wash the wound of the bird with 9 heads. The princess, however, motioned to the youth to hide, and he did so because This was a large-scale bird with 9 heads. When the king's daughter had washed the wound and bandaged it, the bird with 9 heads felt so comfortable that one after another of his 9 heads soon fell asleep. Then the youth stepped forth from his hiding place and cut off the 9 heads with a sword. Shoop! But the king's daughter said, "It could be best if you were hauled up first and I came after." She was a little nervous about being in that basket. "No," said the youth, "I'll wait below here until you are in safety." At first, the king's daughter was not willing, yet at last she allowed herself to be persuaded and climbed into the basket. And before she did so, she took a long pin from her hair and broke it into 2 halves. She gave him one and she kept the other. She so divided her silken kerchief to him and told him to take good care of both of her gifts. But when the other man had drawn up the king's daughter in the basket, he took her along with him and left the youth in the cave, in spite of him calling and pleading for the basket to be lowered down so he could escape. The youth now took a walk about the cave, where he saw a number of maidens, all of whom had been carried off by the bird with 9 heads, and who had perished of hunger. So he's looking at now, this may be his demise. On the wall hung a fish, nailed against it with 4 nails. When he touched the fish, a ladder turned into a handsome youth who thanked him for delivering him, and they agreed to regard each other as brothers. Soon, the first youth grew very hungry. He stepped out in front of the cave to search for food, but only stones were lying there. Then suddenly he saw a great dragon who was licking one of the stones. The youth imitated to him. Before long, his hunger had disappeared. He next asked the dragon how he could get away from the cave, and the dragon nodded his head in the direction of his tail, as much as to say he should seat himself upon it. So he climbed up, and in a twinkling of the eye, he was down on the ground, and the dragon had disappeared. He went on until he found a tortoise shell full of beautiful pearls, but they were magic pearls. For if you flung them into the fire ceased to burn, and if you flung them into the water divided, and you could walk through the midst of it. The youth took the pearls out of the tortoise shell and put them in his pocket. Not long after, he reached a seashore. There he flung the pearls into the sea, and at once the waters divided, and he could see the sea dragon. And the sea dragon called, "Who is disturbing me here in my own kingdom?" The youth answered, "I found pearls in a tortoise shell and have flung them into the sea, and now the waters have divided for me." "If that's the case," said the dragon, "then come into the sea with me, and we will live here together." Then the youth recognized him for the same dragon whom he had seen in the cave. And with him was the youth who had been formed into a bond of brotherhood. He was the dragon's son. "Since you are a brother to my son, I am your father," said the old dragon, and he entertained him hospitably with food and wine. One day his friend said to him, "My father sure wants to reward you, but accept no money, nor any jewels from him, but only a little gourd flask over yonder. With it you can conjure up whatever you wish." And sure enough, the old dragon asked him what he wanted as his way of reward. And the youth answered, "I want no money, nor any jewels. All I want is that little gourd flask over yonder." At first, the dragon did not wish to give it up, but at last he did and let him have it after all. And then the youth left the dragon's castle. When he set foot on dry land again, he felt hungry. At once a table stood before him, covered with a fine, plentiful meal. He ate and drank. After he had gone on a while, he felt tired and weary. And there stood an ass, a donkey, waiting for him, on which he mounted. And after he had ridden a while, the donkey's gait seemed too uneven, and along came a wagon into which he climbed. But the wagon shook him up too greatly, and he thought, if I only had a litter, that would suit me better. No more than he thought so, then a litter came along, and he was seated himself on it. And the bearers carried him to the city, which dwelt the king, the queen, and the daughter who had been captured by the bird with 9 heads. When the other youth had brought back the king's daughter, it was decided to hold a wedding. But the king's daughter was not willing and said, "He is not the right man. My deliverer will come and bring me half of a long pin for my hair and half of my silken kerchief as a token." But when the youth did not appear for a long time, and the other one kept pressing the king grew impatient and said, "The wedding shall take place tomorrow." Then the king's daughter went sadly through the streets of the city, searching and searching in hopes that she would find her deliverer. And this was on the very day that the litter arrived. The king's daughter saw the half of her silken handkerchief in the youth's hand and was filled with joy. She led him to her father. There he had to show his half of a long pin, which fitted the other exactly, and then the king was convinced that he was the right, true deliverer. The false bridegroom was now punished, and the wedding celebrated, and the two lived in peace and happiness until the end of their days. Now, this is a traditional narrated a fairy tale, and there's also bits and pieces of some biblical um, interesting analogies there with the waters parting, the parting of the sea. I found that fascinating to see that that's kind of interwoven into this tale. Our next area that we're going to go in the world is Australia. Australia is a country that includes the Australian continent, the island of Tasmania, and other small islands. Indigenous people are living in Australia for over 400,000 years. Their stories are tightly connected to the Australian outback and its plants and animals and inhabitants. This one comes from an Australian book of legendary tales, and the author is Mrs. K. Langloh Parker. And this was from the 1800s. Gala and Ula the Lizard, Australian folktale. Ula the Lizard had lived in the desert. She was tired of lying in the sun doing nothing. So she said, "I'll go to play," and took the boomerangs out and began to practice throwing them. And while doing so, Gala came up and stood near, watching the boomerangs come flying back. For this was the kind of boomerang, the smaller ones. Ula was throwing baberas. They're more curved, and when they are properly thrown, they return to the thrower, which other boomerangs do not. Ula was proud of having the gay Gala to watch their skill. In their pride, they gave Babera a extra twist and threw it with all their might. Whizzing through the air, back it came, hitting as it passed her, the Gala, on top of her head, taking both feathers and skin clean off. The Gala set up a hideous, cawing, croaking shriek and flew about, stopping every few minutes to knock her head on the ground like a mad bird. Ula was so frightened when they saw what they had done. They noticed that the blood was flowing from Gala's head, and they glided away to hide under a bende bush. But Gala saw them. She never stopped the hideous noise she was making for 1 minute, but still shrieking, she followed Ula. When she reached the bende bush, she reached at Ula, seizing them with her beak, rolling them in the bush until every thorn had made a hole in their skin. Then she rubbed the skin with her own bleeding head. Now then, she said, you Ula shall carry these thorns on you always, and the stain of my blood. And you, said Ula, as they hissed in pain from the tingling of the prickles, shall be a bald-headed bird for as long as I am a red, prickly lizard. And so to this day, underneath the Gala's crest, you can always find a bald patch with which the Babera of Ula first made. And in the country of Galas are lizards colored reddish brown and covered with spikes of these little prickles from the tree. So here we have an explanation for why these two creatures look the way they do, why there are missing bald feathers on this bird, and why this particular lizard is thorny and prickly. This tale is Diriri and the Rainbow. This too comes from Australia. Diriri was a widow and lived in a camp alone with her 4 girls. One day, Bibi came and made a camp not far from hers. Diriri was frightened of him, too frightened to go to sleep. All night, she used to watch his camp, and if she heard a sound, she would cry out, Dear Cree, Diriri. Sometimes she would be calling out nearly all night long. In the morning, Bibi would come over to her camp and ask what was the matter that she called out so in the night. She told him that she thought she heard someone walking about and was afraid, for she was alone with her 4 girls. He told her she ought not to be afraid with her girls around her, but night after night she sat up crying, wah, wah, dearie, dearie. At last, Bibi said, You are so frightened. Marry me and live in my camp. I will take care of you. But Diriri said she did not want to marry. So night after night was to be heard her cry, Diriri, Diriri. And again, Bibi pressed her to share his camp and marry him. But she always refused. The more she refused, the more he wished to marry her. And he used to wonder how he could induce her to change her mind. At last, he thought of a plan of surprising her into giving her consent. He set to work to make a beautiful and many-colored arch, which when it was made, he called Ulirwi, and he placed it right across the sky, reaching from one side of the earth to the other. And when the rainbow was firmly placed in the sky and showing out in all its brilliance of many colors as a roadway from earth to the stars, Bibi went into his camp to wait. When Diriri looked up in the sky and saw this wonderful rainbow, she thought something dreadful must be going to happen. She was terribly frightened and called out aloud, Wah, wah. In her fear, she gathered her children together and fled with them to Bibi's camp for protection. Bibi proudly told her that he had made the rainbow just to show how strong he was and how safe she could be if she married him. But if she would not, she would see what terrible things he would make come on the earth. Not just a harmless, beautiful roadway across the heavens, but things that would burst from the earth and destroy it. So, by working her mixed feelings of fear and his prowess and admiration of his skill, Bibi gained his desire, and Diriri married him. Long afterwards, they died. Diriri was changed into a little willy wagtail, who may be heard through the stillness of the summer nights, crying her plentiful wail of Diriri, wah, wah, Diriri. And Bibi was changed into a climbing tree bird who was always running up trees as if he wanted to be building other ways than that famous roadway from earth to the sky, the rainbow, which had won him his wife. So here are 2 birds that are indigenous to Australia. So we have them both here in an explanation as to how they came about, and also an explanation of how rainbows came about. Next, we are going to Europe. Europe is the second smallest continent on Earth, the birthplace of Western culture. Europe is a land with tremendous cultural and ethnic diversity. We're going to go first to Sweden. Sweden is a country in Northern Europe, and the Swedes are Nordic people, descendants of the mighty Vikings. The Swedish Empire was one of the greatest powers in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. This came from the Swedish fairy book, and it had various authors. And again, this book is from the 1800s. The Skalunda giant, and this is from Swedish folklore. The Skalunda mountain near the church, there once lived a giant in the early days who no longer felt comfortable after the church had been built there. At length, he decided that he could no longer stand the ringing of the church bells. So he immigrated and settled down on an island far out in the northern sea. Once upon a time, a ship was wrecked on this island, and among those saved were several people from Skalunda. "Whence do you hail?" asked the giant, who by now had grown old and blind, and sat warming himself before a log fire. "We are from Skalunda, if you wish to know," said one of the men saved. "Give me your hand so that I may feel whether there is still warm blood to be found in Swedish land," said the giant. The man, who feared to shake hands with the giant, drew a red-hot bar of iron from the fire and handed it to him. He seized it firmly and pressed it so hard that the molten iron ran down between his fingers. "Yes, there is still warm blood to be found in Sweden," said he. "And tell me," he continued, "is Skalunda Mountain still standing?" "No, the hens have scratched it away," the man answered. "How could it last?" said the giant. "My wife and daughter piled it up in a course of a single Sunday morning. But surely the Hallenberg and the Hunnenberg are still standing, for those I built myself." When the man had confirmed this, the giant wanted to know whether Karen was still living in Stommen. And when they told him that she was, he gave them a girdle, and with it the message that Karen was to wear it in remembrance of him. The men took the girdle and gave it to Karen upon their return home. But before Karen put it on, she clasped it around an oak tree that grew in the court. No sooner than she had done so than an oak tore itself out of the ground and flew to the north, borne away by the storm wind. In the place where it had stood was a deep pit, and the roots from the tree were so enormous that one of the best springs in Stroman flows from one of those root holes to this very day. So again, we have reasons for why the mountains are so and where they came from, and now who and how this beautiful spring that flows began. And Karen was the giant's love interest, his wife. This is another tale from Scandinavian folklore, and this is from a book called Folklore and Legends, Scandinavia by Charles John Tibbets. And this is the origin of Tislake. A troll had once taken his abode near the village of Kund, in the high bank on which the church now stands. But when the people about there had become pious and went constantly to church, the troll was dreadfully annoyed by their almost incessant ringing of bells in the steeple of the church. And in my past classes, I have talked about the fairy folk, those that are in the different realms here, and trolls would fall into that. Church bells are what can repel them. So it's showing up in our Scandinavian folklore as such. He was last obliged, in consequence of it, to take his departure, for nothing has more contributed to the immigration of troll folk out of this country than the increasing piety of the people and their taking to bell ringing. The troll of Kund accordingly quitted the country, and he went over to Fruin, where he lived for more time in peace and quiet. Now it chanced that a man who had lately settled in the town of Kund, coming from Fruin on business, met that same troll on the road. "Where do you live?" asked the troll. Now there was nothing whatever about the troll unlike a man, so he answered him as was the truth. "I am from the town of Kund." "So," said the troll, "I don't know you then. And yet I think I know every man in Kund. Will you, however," he said, "be so kind as to take a letter for me back with you to Kund?" The man, of course, said he had no objection. The troll put a letter in his pocket and charged him strictly not to take it out until he came to the Kund church. Then he was to throw it over the churchyard wall, and the person from whom it was intended would get it. The troll went away in great haste, and with him the letter went entirely out of the man's mind. But when he was back to Kund, he sat in a meadow there, near where Tess Lake now is, and suddenly remembered the troll's letter. He felt a great desire to look at it at least, so he took it out of his pocket and sat a while with it in his hands, when suddenly there began to dribble a little water out of the seal. The letter now unfolded itself, and the water came out faster and faster. And it was with the utmost difficulty the poor man was able to save his life, for the malicious troll had enclosed a whole lake in that letter. So he is avenging himself of those church bells and Kund, and by destroying, he was going to destroy the church. But thank goodness this young man sat down and unfolded the letter in an area where this beautiful lake now stands. So we have a reason why the lake is there. So we have an explanation for it. Now we have an English folk tale, and this is from the book of English Fairy Tales, and the author is Joseph Jacobs, and this is called Fairy Ointment. Dame Goody was a nurse that looked after sick people and minded babies. One night, she was woke up at midnight, and when she went downstairs, she saw a strange, squinty-eyed, ugly little fellow who asked her to come to his wife, who was too ill to mind her baby. Dame Goody didn't really like the look of the old fellow, but business is business. So she popped on her things and went down to him. When she got down to him, he whisked her up on a large coal-black horse with fiery eyes that stood at the door. And soon they were going like a rare pace, Dame Goody holding on to the old fellow like grim death. They rode and rode till at last they stopped before a cottage door. So they got down and went in and found a good woman abed with the children playing about, and the babe, a fine bouncing boy, beside her. Dame Goody took the babe, which was as fine a baby boy as you'd wish to see. The mother, when she handed the baby to Dame Goody to mind, gave her a box of ointment and told her to stroke the baby's eyes with it as soon as it opened. After a while, it began to open its eyes, and Dame Goody saw that it had squinty eyes just like its father. So she took out the box of ointment and stroked its two eyelids with it. But she couldn't help wondering what it was for, as she'd never seen such a thing done. So she looked to see if the others were looking, and when they were not noticing, she stroked one of her own, her right eyelid, with the ointment. No sooner had she done so than everything seemed completely changed about her. The cottage became elegantly furnished. The mother in bed was the beautiful lady dressed in white silk. The little baby was still more beautiful than before, and its clothes were made of a sort of silvery gauze. And its brothers and sisters around the bed were flat-nosed imps with pointy ears who made faces at one another and scratched their poles. Sometimes they would pull the sick lady's ears with their long, hairy paws. In fact, they were up to all kinds of mischief, and Dame Goody knew that she had got into a house of pixies. But she said nothing to no one, and as soon as the lady was well enough to mind the baby, she asked the old fellow to take her back home. So he came around to the door with the cold black horse with the eyes of fire, and off they went as fast as before, maybe a little faster, till they came to Dame Goody's cottage, where the squinty-eyed old fellow lifted her down and left her, thanking her civilly enough, and paying her more than she ever had been paid before for such a service. The next day happened to be market day, and as Dame Goody had been away from home, she wanted many things for the house, so she trudged off to get them at the market. As she was buying things that she wanted, who should she see but the squinty-eyed old fellow who had taken her on the cold black horse. And what do you think he was doing? Why, he went about from stall to stall, taking up things from each. Here's some fruit, there's some eggs, and so on. But no one seemed to take any notice of him. Now, Dame Goody didn't think it her business to interfere, but she thought she ought to not let so good a customer pass without speaking. So she goes up to him and bobs a curtsy and said, "Good day, sir. I hope how your good lady is doing and the little one are faring well." But she couldn't finish what she was saying, for the funny little fellow started back in surprise, and he says to her, "What? Do you see me today?" "See you," she says. "Why, of course I do, as plain as the sun in the sky. And what's more, I see you're busy too, into the bargain." "Ah, you see too much," he said. "Now, pray, with which eye do you see all this?" "With the right eye, to be sure," she said, as proud as can be. "The ointment, the ointment!" cried the old pixie thief. "Take that for meddling with what don't concern you. You shall see me no more." And with that, he struck her on the right eye, and she couldn't see him anymore. And what's worse, she was blind in the right side from that hour to the day of her death. So that magic pixie cream can make you see, the wee folk. Now we have a French tale, and this is The Three Spinning Women. There once was a poor woman who had a beautiful daughter. They lived near a hotel. Every morning, after the last stroke of 7, the mother explained, "And 7 have passed." By that, he meant that her daughter had already swallowed 7 platefuls of soup. One day, the king's son came to that part of the country and stopped in the hotel, and he went to the window and saw the beautiful girl and fell immediately in love with her. The next morning, when 7 o'clock came, he was at the window. He heard the old woman say, "And 7 have passed." He wanted to know what these words meant and asked the hostess to explain. And she said, "Oh, we are poor, and we only have work for the young girl to feed 7 of them." I guess that her mother says that it means it's 7 o'clock in the morning and her daughter has already spun 7 spindles. A few moments later, he went over to the old woman and asked for her daughter's hand in marriage. The mother said that it would be difficult, but the prince listened to nothing, and within an hour, he married the young girl. A few years later, the prince had to go away to fight his enemies, and before leaving, he left 3 huge rooms full of hemp for her to spin. After he left, his wife, who didn't even know how to hold a spindle in her hands, spent her days crying. One day she saw 3 women passing by. They greeted her and asked her why she was so sad, and she told them what had happened. "Oh, don't torment yourself anymore. We'll do it for you. In 1 hour, all your hemp will be spun. In return, we want to be invited to dinner when your husband returns. You have to call us aunts, your aunts." Then when your husband asks you to go and get us, go to the stairway and shout, Aunt Percy, Aunt Sophie, Aunt Crucy, the time has come, and we shall appear. Then the queen took the old woman to the 3 rooms. Each was given her own room, and they were spinning and spinning and spinning fast. And in 1 hour, everything was spun, and the 3 old women disappeared. Shortly after, her husband returned from war and praised her for all the hard spinning work she had done. The queen told him, I have 3 aunts who would like to dine with us once. Can I invite them? Certainly, go get them today. There's no need to run, said the beautiful queen, and from the stairway she called, Aunt Percy, Aunt Sophie, Aunt Chrissy, its time has come. Suddenly they heard a loud noise, and 3 probably ugly women appeared. One of them had eyelashes that reached her knees. One had lips that reached her waist. The arms of the third were so long that they were sweeping the floor. The king and queen were horrified at the sight of them. Towards the end of the dinner, one of the 3 aunts said, Sire, it surprises us to see how ugly we are, doesn't it? So allow us to tell you how we've become like this. If I have long eyelashes, it's because I spend all my evenings spinning. My lips have become so thick and sagging, said the second, because while spinning, I put my fingers to my lips to wet them and twine the thread better. My arms have become so long after turning the spindle with force, said the third. The same thing could happen to your wife if she should go on spinning. The king decided that his beautiful queen would never have to work again in her life, and she lived a long and very happy, do-nothing life. And this tale is interesting to me because it has little bits and pieces of other tales that we're familiar with, like Rumpelstiltskin, a little bit of Cinderella, and a little bit of Sleeping Beauty kind of all spun into this tale. All right, our next area we're going to travel to is North America. North America is the 3rd largest continent on the earth. North America was prior to the Europeans, there were numerous native nations living in North America. So we will have a couple tales of North American descent. So our first tale is one that is about a baker's dozen that I found. It's sort of a New England tale, and it has dramatic background to it and Swedish as well. So we will listen to this. And this is from the book Myths and Legends of Our Own Land, Volume 1, The Hudsons and Its Hills by Charles M. Skinner. And this is entitled The Baker's Dozen. Boss Volkert Jan Peterson von Amsterdam kept a bake shop in Albany and lives in history as the man who invented New Year's cakes and made gingerbread babies in the likeness of his own large offspring. Good churchman thought he was. The bane of his life was the fear of being bewitched, and perhaps it was to keep out evil spirits who might take one last effort to gain the mastery over him ere he turned the customary leaf with the coming of the year, that he had primed himself with an extra glass of spirits on the night of 1654. His sales had been brisk, and as he sat in his little shop meditating comfortably on the gains he would make when his harmless rivals, the Knickerbakers, the bakers of marbles, sent for their usual supply of Oly cakes and mince pies on the morrow, he was startled by a sharp rap, and an ugly old woman entered. Give me a dozen New Year's cookies, she cried in a shrill voice. You don't need to speak so loud. I'm not deaf, he said. A dozen, she screamed. Give me a dozen. Here are only 12. Well, I have a half a dozen. I want more. I want a dozen. Well, if you want another, you can go to the devil and get it. Well, did the hag take him on his word? She left the shop, and from that time it seemed as if poor Volker was bewitched, indeed, for his cakes were stolen. His bread was so light that it went boop, right up the chimney. And when it was not so heavy, when it was not so light, it was so heavy that it fell through the oven. Invisible hands plucked bricks from the same oven and pelted him until he was blue. His wife became deaf, his children went unkept, and his trade went elsewhere. Thrice the old woman reappeared, and each time was sent anew to the devil. But at last, in despair, the baker called on St. Nicholas to come and advise him. His call was answered with a startling quickness, for almost while he was making it, there stood before him was St. Nicholas. The good soul advised the trembling man to be more generous in his dealings with fellows, and after a lecture on charity, he vanished, when lo, the old woman was there in his place. She repeated her demand for more cakes. I want 12, one more cake. And Volkart Jan Peterson gave it, whereupon she exclaimed, the spell is broken, and from this time a dozen is 13. Taking from the counter a gingerbread effigy of St. Nicholas, she made the astonished Dutchman lay his hand upon it and swear to give more liberal measure in the future. So until 13 new states arose from the ruins of the colonies, when the shrewd Yankees restored the original measure, 13 made a baker's dozen. And here we have a Native American folk tale, The Origin of Fire. Long, long ago, animals and trees talked to each other, but there was no fire at that time. Fox was most clever, and he tried to think of a way to create fire for the world. One day he decided to visit the geese, whose cry he wished to learn how to imitate. They promised to teach him if he would fly with them. So they contrived a way to attach wings to Fox, but cautioned him never to open his eyes while flying. Whenever the geese rose in flight, Fox also flew along with them to practice their cry. On one such adventure, darkness descended suddenly as they flew over a village of fireflies. In mid-flight, the glare from the flickering fireflies caused Fox to forget, and he opened his eyes. Instantly, his wings collapsed. His fall was uncontrollable. He landed within the walled area of the firefly village, where a fire constantly burned in the center. Two kind fireflies came to see the fallen fox, who gave each one a necklace of juniper berries. Fox hoped to persuade the two fireflies to tell him where he could find a way over the wall to the outside. They led him to a cedar tree, which they explained would bend down upon command and catapult him over the wall if he so desired. That evening, Fox found the spring where fireflies obtained their water. There also he discovered colored earth, which when mixed with water made paint. He decided to give himself a coat of white. Upon returning to the village, Fox suggested the fireflies, let's have a festival where we can dance and I will produce music. They all agreed that that would be fun and helped to gather wood to build up a greater fire. Secretly, Fox tied a piece of cedar bark to his tail. Then he made a drum, probably the first drum ever constructed, and beat it vigorously with a stick for the dancing fireflies. Gradually, he moved closer and closer to the fire. Fox pretended to tire from beating his drum. He gave it to some of the fireflies who wanted to help make music. Fox quickly thrust his tail into the fire, lighting the bark, and exclaimed, "It's too warm for me here. I must find a cooler place." Straight to the cedar tree Fox ran, calling, "Bend down to me, my cedar tree, bend down." Down bent the cedar tree for Fox to catch hold, and then up carried him far over the wall. On and on he ran, with the fireflies in pursuit. As Fox ran along, brush and wood on either side of his path were ignited with the sparks dropping from the burning bark tied to his tail. Fox finally tired and gave the burning bark to Hawk, who carried it to Brown Crane. He flew far southward, scattering fire sparks everywhere. This is how fire first spread over the earth. Fireflies continued chasing Fox all the way to his burrow and declared, "Forever after, Wily Fox, your punishment for stealing our fire will be that you can never make use of it for yourself." Now we're going down into South America, and it's the fourth largest continent on Earth. And we're going to focus on Brazil, which is a country in South America. It's the largest country on the continent, and Brazil is home to a diverse wildlife and natural environment. This tale comes from a book called Fairy Tales from Brazil. Elsie Spicer Ells is the author, and it's How the Tiger Got His Stripes. Once upon a time, ages and ages ago, so long ago that the tiger had no stripes upon his back and the rabbit still had his tail, there was a tiger who had a farm. And the farm was very much overgrown with underbrush, and the owner sought a workman to clear the ground for him to plant. The tiger called all the beasts together and said to them when they were assembled, "I need a good workman at once to clear my farm of underbrush. To the one who will do this, I will offer an ox as payment." Monkey was the first one to step forward and apply for the position. And Tiger tried him for a little while, but he was not a good workman at all. He didn't work steadily enough to really accomplish anything. So the tiger discharged him very soon and did not pay him. Then Tiger hired a goat to do all the work. The goat worked faithfully enough, but he didn't have the brains to do the work well. He would clear a little of the farm in one place, and then he would go away and work on another part of it. He never finished anything neatly, so the tiger discharged him very soon without paying him. Next, the tiger tried an armadillo. The armadillo was very strong and he did work well. The trouble with him was that he had such an appetite. There were a great many ants about the place, and the armadillo could never pass up their little sweet, tender juice that an ant would offer, and he'd stop and eat them. It was lunchtime all the day long to him. Tiger discharged him and sent him away without paying him anything. At last, Rabbit applied for the position, and the tiger laughed at him, saying, "Why, little Rabbit, you're too small to do all that work. The monkey, the goat, the armadillo all have failed to give satisfaction. Of course, a little beast like you will fail too." However, there were no other beasts who applied for the position, so the tiger sent the rabbit and told him that he would try him for a little while. The rabbit worked faithfully and well, and soon he had cleared a large portion of the ground. The next day he worked just as well, and the tiger thought that he had been very lucky to hire the rabbit. He got tired staying around to watch the rabbit work, and the rabbit seemed to know just how to do the work anyway without orders, so Tiger decided to go away on a hunting trip. He left his son to watch rabbit. After the tiger had gone away, the rabbit said to the tiger's son, "The ox which your father is going to give me is marked with a white spot on the left ear and another on its right side, isn't he?" "Oh, no," replied Tiger's son. "He is red all over with just a tiny white spot on its right ear." The rabbit worked for a little longer, and then he said, "The ox which your father's going to give me is kept by the river, isn't he?" "Yes," replied the tiger's son. The rabbit made plan to go and get the ox without waiting to finish his work. Just as he started off, he saw the tiger returning. and the tiger noticed that the rabbit had not worked so well as when he was away. After that, he stayed and watched the rabbit until the whole farm was cleared. Then the tiger gave the rabbit the ox as he promised. "You must kill this ox," he said to the rabbit, "in a place where there are neither flies nor mosquitoes." Rabbit went away with the fox, and after he had gone some distance, he thought he would kill him. He heard a cock, however, crowing in the distance, and he knew that there must be a farmyard near, and there would be flies, of course. So he went farther, and again he thought he'd kill the ox. The ground looked moist and damp. So did the leaves on the bushes. Since the rabbit thought there might be mosquitoes there, he decided that wouldn't be the place to kill the ox either. He went on and on until finally he came to a very high place where there was a strong breeze blowing. "There are no mosquitoes here," he said. "This place is so far removed from any habitation that there are no flies either." He decided to kill the ox. Just as he was ready to eat the ox, along came Tiger. "Oh, Rabbit, you've been such a good friend of mine," said the tiger, "and now I'm so very, very hungry that all my ribs show, as you yourself can see. Will you not be a good rabbit, a kind rabbit, and give me a piece of your ox?" Rabbit gave Tiger a piece of the ox. Tiger devoured it in a twinkling of an eye. Then he leaned back and said, "Is that all you're going to give me to eat?" The tiger looked so big and savage that the rabbit didn't dare refuse him any more of the ox. The tiger ate and ate and ate until he had devoured the entire ox. The rabbit had been able to only get a tiny morsel of it. He was very, very angry at Tiger. One day, not long after that, Tiger went to a place not far from the tiger's house and began cutting down big staves of wood. The tiger soon happened along and asked him what he was doing. "I'm getting ready to build a stockade around myself," replied the rabbit. "Haven't you heard the orders?" Tiger said he hadn't heard any orders. "That's very strange," said Rabbit. "The order has gone forth that every beast shall fortify himself by building a stockade around himself, and all beasts are doing it." Tiger became very alarmed. Oh dear, what shall I do?" he cried. I don't know how to build a stockade. I could never do it in the world." "Oh, good rabbit, oh, kind rabbit, you are such a very good friend of mine. Couldn't you, as a great favor, because of our long friendship, build a stockade about me before you build one about yourself?" The rabbit replied that he could not think of risking his own life by building the tiger's fortifications first. Finally, however, he consented to do it. The rabbit cut down great quantities of long, sharp sticks. He set them firmly in the ground about the tiger. He fastened others securely over the top of the tiger, and he was completely locked in, just like he had strong bars around him. And then Rabbit went away and left the tiger. The tiger waited and waited for something to happen to show him the need of the fortifications. Nothing happened at all. He got very hungry and thirsty, and after a while the monkey came by. Tiger cried out, "Oh, monkey, has the danger passed?" And the monkey didn't know what danger the tiger meant, but replied, "Yes." Then the tiger said, oh, good monkey, kind monkey, will you please be so kind as to help me out of my stockade?" "Let the one who got you in there help you out," replied the monkey, and he went on his way. Along came the goat, and Tiger called out, "Oh, goat, has the danger passed?" The goat didn't know of any danger, but he replied, "Yeah." Then the tiger said, "Oh, goat, oh, good, kind goat, please help me out of my stockade." He replied, "Let the one who got you in there help you out." And then the goat went away. Along came Armadillo, and the tiger called out the same thing. "Has the danger passed?" And Armadillo didn't know of any danger, but he replied, "Yeah, it's passed." Then Tiger said, "Oh, Armadillo, oh, good, kind Armadillo, you've always been such a good friend and neighbor. Please help me out of my stockade." And he replied, Let the one who got you in there help you out." And the armadillo went on his way. Tiger jumped and jumped, jumped with all his force at the top of the stockade, but he couldn't break it though. And he jumped and jumped with all his might at the front side of the stockade, but he couldn't break it. And he thought that he would never in the world would he be able to break out. And he rested for a while, and as he rested, he thought how bright the sun was shining outside, and he thought what good hunting there was in the jungle, and he thought how cool the water was at the spring. Once more, he jumped and jumped with all his might at the back side of the stockade, and at last he broke through. He didn't get all the way through, however, without getting bad cuts on both of his sides from the sharp edges of the staves of the stockade. Until this day, the tiger has stripes on both sides. We have so many great folk tales to share. I do encourage you to several books that have incredible tales. And we're going to skip our Inuit because of time, but it's a wonderful tale. And I encourage you to look it up. It's How Crow Brings the Daylight. It's a wonderful tale. Folk tales and fables allow us to experience the ways a society develops a sense of moral behavior. And today we can learn its rich literary heritage, which provides both a window into other cultures and a mirror that allows viewers to reflect more clearly on aspects of their cultures and lives. Here are a few books that I do recommend. Best Loved Folk Tales by Joanna Cole. Fearless Girls, Wise Women, and Beloved Sisters, Heroines in Folk Tales from Around the World by Kathleen Raglan and Jane Yolen. Favorite African Folk Tales, and it's by Nelson Mandela. Grandfathers Speak, Native American Folk Tales of the Lenape People. And we have Asian Pacific Folk Tales and Legends by Jeanette Ferrot. And Nordic Tales, Folk Tales from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark by Chronicle Books. And the author is Ulla Feinel. Great books here, folks. I want to thank everyone for journeying through Spirited History with me. I've been your host, Leanne Ball. You can catch my podcast, Spirited History, every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the ParaX Radio Network. You can go to our website, spiritedhistory.com. And if you want to shoot me an email, it's at spiritedhistory@gmail.com. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thanks a lot, Leanne.
Bye.
Great stories.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed it.